Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. I'm excited to be with all of you today. Today I'm going to be discussing something monumental, NASA's Artemis program. I'm going to go over the basics of it, the past, the history, and where it is headed. It's the dawn of a new era of space exploration, so let's dive in and see what Artemis is all about. The Artemis program is NASA's ambitious initiative to return humans to the moon, this time to stay. Named after Artemis, the twin sister of Apollo in Greek mythology, it symbolizes a modern, inclusive approach to lunar exploration. Apollo brought the first humans to the moon about 50 years ago, but Artemis has a broader vision. That vision is to establish a sustainable human presence on the moon, build new technologies, and lay the groundwork for human missions to Mars. It's not just about visiting the moon again, it's about creating a permanent lunar outpost to be used to go to Mars and beyond. The program is being rolled out in phases. Artemis 1 was an uncrewed mission launched in November of 2022. It tested the Space Launch System rocket and the Orion spacecraft during a trip around the moon and back. Everything performed beautifully. This paved the way for the next step, to develop the architecture and hardware for the Artemis 2 mission, which would be the first mission to carry humans. This was scheduled for late 2024, but as we see today, this mission has already been delayed till 2025, the earliest. This mission will send astronauts on a similar journey as Artemis 1 around the moon, but without a landing. It'll be humanity's first trip to the moon since 1972. It'll include the first woman on a lunar exploration mission and the first man of color, as well as the first Canadian citizen. NASA, as an administration, has decided that they want to go back with all and for all on this lunar mission. Artemis 3 is the big one. Originally planned for 2025, although more looking at a 2026 or 2027 earliest landing date, Artemis 3 will land the first woman and the first person of color on the lunar surface ever. The target landing site is the moon's south pole, an area that is perceived to potentially harbor water ice, which could be used for critical long-term exploration. There are shadow areas there that can be used to shield themselves from potential radiation from the sun's rays and the Earth's dangerous Ray Allen belt. The Artemis program visibly seems as though it is just SLS, the rocket itself, but the rocket has plans to provide the mission overarching future goals. The first is the Lunar Gateway. The Lunar Gateway is a space station that will orbit the moon and serve as a staging point for lunar missions. Think of it as a lunar pit stop for astronauts traveling to and from the moon. It will be safer for them to stay on the station, as it can have technology that will shield them from the radiation that might not be as effective on the lunar surface. They then can use technology, potentially from Blue Origin or SpaceX's Starship, to then travel to the surface and back up. The Lunar Gateway will also serve as a sustainable reach for a lunar base. The goal of a sustainable lunar base is the bridging step between us and Mars. It is a proving ground for if we can actually live on the surface of another celestial body. And this is the framework for what the SLS mission is trying to do. The base will allow humans to live and work on the moon for extended periods of time, where science, engineering, and innovation will happen and hopefully thrive. Artemis is using an interesting architecture to go around the moon. It is using a long moon retrograde orbit. This means that it is going to use a retrograde burn to get out of the Earth's gravity and insert itself into a trajectory that'll go around the moon. Once in the moon's orbit, it'll have another burn that will allow it to go into a long elliptical orbit around the moon. This is where the Lunar Gateway will also be parked. This orbit allows for Orion spacecraft and the Gateway to cross over the North and South Pole, which is where we are trying to land. By detaching from earlier in the elliptical orbit, we can add a landing burn that will allow us to touch down on the South Pole. The technologies required to serve as the human landers that were potentially being built by Blue Origin and SpaceX are not yet completed. This means that Artemis 3 will likely be delayed years, and it is potentially possible that we might see a landing before 2030, but it is not guaranteed. It is unfortunate that there are multiple delays, although unfortunately this has been a large problem for Artemis and previous missions. Everyone is familiar with the Apollo program, the rocket, and what it did. You could think of the Apollo program as the grandfather to this mission. You can see the rocket looks quite different and unique as it uses a refined kerosene fuel and is a 3-stage vehicle. If you look at the space shuttle, you see it looks extremely different, although the space shuttle has a lot of similarities to the SLS we see today. You could think of the Apollo rocket as the grandfather, and you could think of the space shuttle as the father. You still see those SRBs that do about 75% of the thrust required to get out of the atmosphere and into the trajectory required to reach orbit. Once those detach using AMRAAM missile motors, you are left with the first stage that is still coasting. Once this first stage is done, it is disposed and burned up in the atmosphere. This was the same thing used on the space shuttle and now being used on the SLS rocket. After this first stage is disposed, the difference between the space shuttle and the SLS is that the SLS has a second stage. This second stage will burn for 4 minutes to get into orbit and then burn again in half a day to perform a lunar retrograde orbit to get around the path of the moon. This will be the rocket the engine that is used to get us back to Earth when the mission is completed. Some of the biggest reasons for delays are the reuse of old technology, such as the SRBs that were used on the shuttle, and the RS-25 engines, which are extremely complicated to work with and come with a heavy price tag of $100 million a pop. That's $400 million of engines alone, without including the price of the SRBs on the space shuttle system. The use of hydrogen as a fuel is also complicated. On the first launch alone, there were 2 scrubs. These were announced on the live streams, sadly, and not many people were happy.
A scrub for the launch attempt today, the second launch attempt.
These issues aside, Artemis will continue to persevere and push the boundary of what is possible. In time, Artemis 2 will launch and take the first 4 astronauts around the moon for the first time since 1972, and Artemis 3, 4, and 5 will follow, paving the way for future missions to Mars and beyond. At the end of this video, I plugged in a 2-minute long high definition of the Artemis 1 launch. I want you to pay attention to the sound of when the SRBs light. This was the brightest rocket launch ever recorded, and the second loudest, right behind the Saturn V rocket. This was significantly louder than the space shuttle due to its immensely larger solid rocket boosters and the addition of an extra RS-25 engine. Take this video to fully appreciate and wrap your head around the enormity of the rocket and the forces it is producing.
The Space Launch System is now counting down and here we go.
10,